All right. Hello, everybody. We have a couple of things on tap today that are really sort of cleanup kind of stuff. We're getting very close, I think, on the documents, and I just wanted to tighten some of that up. Kevin could not be here today, so this is going to have to be more of a general conversation about add versus create and remove versus delete. I had hoped that he would be here and that potentially we could have more of a conversation in Slack. I started it this morning. And so LOC has been using add and remove and update. And Getty, as far as I can see in theirs, I've only seen creates. I haven't seen any other activities. So the conversation I was interested in having is looking at the definitions for add and create and just seeing what folks think and whether or not one seems to fit better than another from the perspective of like what we would recommend in the documentation. So that I think is ours. Oh, that's going to be ours too. So I'm just going to jump over to the documentation, the activity types, and then we can look and see what add says. So the definitions are pretty similar. I think I actually might copy them into the notes so we can see them side by side. They are in Slack if you saw that message earlier. And I'll copy in create as well, which I think is just down from this. Create is actually much shorter definition. So to me, it looks like the question is, might be something like, did the object exist beforehand? If not, it was created. If it did, then it was just added to a new place. But I'd be interested in what others' interpretation would be on this. Sorry, the other note I would make is that Getty is used, I may have already said this already, but Getty is using create and Library of Congress is using add. So anyone else's thoughts on this?
Well, technically it's different semantics. So add presumes pre-existence of the object.
Yeah, that was kind of my take on it too.
And affiliates it to some context, whereas create creates a new object irrespective of whether it's contextualized. So I guess I would say creates assuming the minting of a new unique URI, whereas add is just employing that URI to attach it to some or multiple graphs.
So can I ask, just to be clear, that this does not have to do with changing? So for example, if you have a term and you've decided that the term that you have is no longer commonly
use and you change it, you kind of, well, you create a new term to replace it. Where does that fall into this? Or does it not?
Well, is the term itself the URI for that, or is the term the label associated with that URI?
I think in our case, both would change.
Right, that could be a way that this is used. So the target, I looked at a couple different implementations or documentation on implementations, and a target could be like a wish list. A target could be when you add something to you could have a list of deprecated terms, and then you would add that you would continue to have a thing. It just is now a member of a new target. So that would be one way you could implement Nancy's scenario where.
So I was wondering, would this be a case of deprecation with a new term? Like ideally, wouldn't that be the way we would want to handle this?
In terms of Nancy's case, yes, I think it is, because it implies a creation and then a deprecation. And probably an update.
Yeah, yes, I think you're right. And I think the issue, and I don't know whether this is pertinent or not, I mean, the issue that we run into is that people still use the deprecated term. But if you have that URI, if you do this URI needs to go to a new URI behind the scenes, if you can do that, then I guess that doesn't matter, right?
Right. It's like a breadcrumb to the new.
Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw it off.
I mean, a similar scenario happens with some headings that end up leaving LCSH and becoming LCNAF or vice versa. I forget which scenario is more common, but you could, I think our current practice is to deprecate one and then create a new URI for the new destination. But you can imagine a scenario where you just add something to a different list.
So you said it leaves LCSH and goes to
LCNAF, the name authority file. Yeah.
And in that case, are you suggesting that, well, I don't know, what happens in practice when that happens? Does it get a new URI?
I think so, yeah. I don't think you can have an LCSH URI within the LCNAF data set. So they do create a new URI, but you can imagine a scenario where
deprecate the LCSH.
Exactly. Yeah.
I could see where that's sort of like, it's like you created a new URI, but you didn't really create a new heading.
Right.
And so I wonder if that's where they come from with doing the add. Although I don't know, because I'm sure that doesn't hold in all cases. I'm sure sometimes it actually truly is a new URI.
Yeah. Well, in these cases, they are new URIs. What I'm suggesting is you could continue to use a single URI for a concept that doesn't change, and then just add or add to a new target the old URI and remove it, have a separate activity that removes it from the other. Or I don't know why it can't exist in both. But.
I do think there would be two activities that would occur for that, because I am assuming, but I would have to check with Kevin, but I would assume that they have a feed for LCSH and then they would have a separate feed for LCNAF, that there would be a feed per authority, that it wouldn't be a shared one.
Right, and that makes sense, because somebody might only be listening to the LCSH feed and want to know.
So I guess like talking about the distinction between those two, I wonder if we should support both, like define both create and add a little bit of extra text that says that for add, this is presuming that it was pre-existent and you're just adding it with a new target, and for create, it would be a whole brand new thing. Does it seem reasonable to support both? with a little more descriptive information about it?
I think it does.
Okay. And I would think remove and delete would be basically the same discussion, because one is the concept of you've removed it from the target, and delete would be it's actually gone away altogether and is no longer supported at all. So okay. Unless someone else has more comments to make about the delete, remove distinction. Okay, I think that's good. I probably could show real quick. I've been putting together the context document, and I have now a repo out in LD4 called Entity Metadata Management. And that's where this stuff is going to live. And so I did start putting together a context. This is from based loosely off of the IIIF one, just to get something started. And one of the things that they did is they described their ordered collection and ordered collection page, which really comes straight out of the activity stream. And I'm not sure why they added in these rights and part of information. So I might check with them and see why they are adding these extended pieces to the context for an individual item. But then we also have all the various activities. So I'm not going to really talk about this in depth because they're there, and I will clean this up some. But you can see we go to deprecate, split, and merge. Those are the three that we added. The rest are standard. And then they also had some additional stuff at the end for label. See also provider would be like our authority providers. And then they do some description of object as well. So I'm going to be cleaning this up some more and definitely looking for some feedback. I will say that they use provider on the object, and we did have some discussions about where to actually identify who is the provider. And so I think that question might come back up, but I just wanted to quickly show that that work is being done, and it's going to end up in that LD4 entity metadata management repo in GitHub. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is we have two documents that talk about object types. And I thought maybe, Stephen, do you feel comfortable talking a little bit about the one that you created? And then we can look at Vitus's as well.
Sure. This isn't the most clearly written document, but what I was trying to do here was think about a way where we could honor the way that activity streams, the spec more broadly, attempts to behave, where it has people out in the world and different types of activities and the things that they create. And so it's a classic semantics problem where the object ID should be for the thing that is created. And in this case, we're talking about RDF that's being created, not the person.
Can I ask a quick question here? Because the place that I'm sitting right now, this looks to me like the feed from LOC as it comes. Is there something different about this? Is this where I should be showing right now, or should I go to a different part of the document?
No, this is fine. Everything that I'm saying is true for this document. Yeah, so you notice here the highlighted piece here is for the names. So it seems appropriate, at least to me, that LC's implementation, or how LC is implementing this, in that the names URI is for the authority. So not the person that the authority is about. So it seems okay to me that this would honor that that activity streams sort of set of semantics. If they were to say the RWO, I would, they are, if they used instead the RWO URI, then I would worry a little bit more. And then you see there that have different serializations down under the URL. So it's type link, and there's different representations of the data. And what's nice about this is that with that names ID, you get the different types. So however the data is modeled, whatever type assertions that that object ID has, then you could just use those. So this is a corporate name, it's a simple type, it's a name, it's an authority. And so no matter how the data is represented, you could do that. I think somewhere else in the document, I talk about more complicated scenarios. Oh, right. So down in the example.org, so not on page, what page is this? Or the last page, I guess, if you could scroll there. For data that's modeled as real world objects, you can imagine an example where there's like a set of data about a person that is the object ID, and then you can say that that data is about the actual person, and then all the assertions are then on the data, but not the person itself. So the person wasn't created, but the data was. And so then you could, under the type there, the about type would then nest whether or not, or what types of things we're talking about. So this, if the feed was for persons, the type would always be persons, but you could also have places and other real world object type things.
So if I could just ask a question real quick. In this case, the about, so where it says example.org/person 12345, that is the actual real world object person.
Right.
And the one above for the ID data example org./person 12345, that is the authority entry.
Yeah, or the
And
data, whatever. Yeah, some
I
sort
see
of
you put type there. Is that just like a generic filter?
Yeah, that's just generic.
Filler?
I thought I saw, I had misread the Getty's implementation, where they, if they don't have a type for that thing, they were just using a generic type. But then you had pointed out at the end of their feed, they don't actually honor this distinction, that they're just using person URIs as the object ID. So I'm reluctant to try to hold this line, or I know I realize I brought it up, but if I don't know how important it is to hold this line depending on how we choose to use activity streams and the IDs. And so if we manage these streams separate from all our other RDF, I imagine this will not be an issue. But you can imagine where you're munging the RDF from an activities feed with the rest of your data, and now you have assertions on the person that they were created in September of 2021, when in fact they weren't actually created then. They were created some 30, 40, 50 years earlier or whatever. So it comes down to how we're managing the activity streams data and what we say about the things in them. And I might be making too big of a issue of that.
Well, I do think this idea of real world object versus authority data about an object. That discussion comes up over and over again. And so like I wasn't completely connecting with what the challenge would be until you gave the example of, well, the person's not created at this date, that their entry was created at this date. And if the second URI is supposed to really represent the actual person, then saying that they were created would be challenging. But if you're saying their authority entries was created, that seems fine.
Right.
So I'd be curious what other people think about that, because like I personally don't work with the data so much as just provide it. And so for those who work with the data a lot, what do you think about this distinction between the real world object and the authority object and how we represent it in the feed?
Well, I think it's important to make that distinction, and because as Stephen was explaining, then different descriptions apply to these two different entities, and you don't want them to be mixed up.
Yeah, maybe a real, or I don't know how likely, but a possible situation would be if you were trying to do a Sparkle describe for that person, and then you find out, and then you have these created assertions on the person. It could be a problem, but it's, I don't know how likely we would store, again, the activity streams RDF with our actual descriptions of the person, places, things, etc.
So it seems to me like if we do an RDF patch, like what would be in the instrument, that what you have in that patch and the RDF you have in that patch is very important to get right, because that's what's actually going to be applied to a cache to update it to make sure it matches. I don't know that the information in the activity stream itself would end up in the cache. It seems to me like it would not, that what they describe here is for the information coming in through the activity stream. But I'm certainly open to hearing if someone thinks that that would be different, that it would happen differently. So as you were talking, Stephen, I sort of thought that, you could recommend using add if it's about the real world object person, but since it is ultimately an entry in the authority, even though it's about the real world person themselves, it's still an entry in the authority, and it's still got created in the authority at a certain point in time. And that's really what we're trying to say here. So I wouldn't think it would be appropriate to say add, even though you're not creating the actual human being. Anyone else have alternate thoughts? So I do like the way that you have in there the about and adding this extra information saying that it's about the actual person, and having a type for the authority entry and a different type for the person. Anyone have thoughts about that? Does that seem to work? Do I take, in this particular case, since we're looking at changing some of the documentation, a lot of times I'll take silence as affirmative, but in this case, I would like to be sure that people are agreeing that that would be a good thing to have in there.
I guess I'm going to defer to the catalogers.
It looks right to me, but I haven't thought about this for a while.
Okay. Stephen, is there anything else in this document that we would look at?
No, the only thing I would say is about there is a common practice in, you see this a lot with RDF XML, where there's an ID, there's a URI for the document, the XML document, and a URI for the actual thing that's being described in the document. So I didn't pull this out of thin air, and we would just have to add RDF namespace to the context for this about. So
Yeah.
just adding it to the context.
Okay.
And then maybe the other thing to say, since there is, maybe there's a middle ground where we can say, we're not convinced that this distinction is super important to maintain. But if you're going to try to maintain it, this is a pattern that you could use. Because again, I had misread the Getty feed and thought that they were holding this distinction, but they don't do this ID about pattern for their persons. They just, the ID for the object in theirs is actually the person. So they made a judgment call not to do this slightly more complicated.
And I think it's good to sort of put some of these things out there as this is a pattern you could use. And so I'll write it up and we can review it again and see what folks think. So I'm wondering, Vitus, I think this is your document, also about object types. And I was wondering if you feel comfortable sort of talking a little bit about what's in this document and see if it relates to some of the discussion we've already been having.
Well, I guess I'm not prepared for that. It's been a while since I wrote that, and I don't really remember what I said.
Yeah, I definitely just kind of threw this at you. I didn't give you a heads up on it. So I was just trying to pull some topics together, and this is one that got punted a number of times, the object types, and so I wanted to see if we could take a moment to look at it. So in that case, I think maybe we'll come back to that another time. So the other topic I had on the agenda is notifications versus cache updates. So I've been thinking about this based on some discussions we had in the past. And this is specific around the idea of including an RDF patch in the instrument. So one of the things I heard in previous discussions is that perhaps the RDF patches aren't as useful as I certainly originally thought. And it sounded to me like maybe they're helpful, but not in as having to look at every single activity in the activity stream, that perhaps they should come in chunks of one big RDF patch document that you can apply and not have to sort of navigate through. And then you just keep applying these series of RDF patch documents. And I wanted to get sort of a take on that, because the way everything's written up right now, it has an RDF patch with each individual activity. And so I guess the question is, notifications sounded like they didn't need them at all. And then the other case of the cache, it sounded like it wanted like a larger all-inclusive document that they could apply, like one document for the whole page.
So Lynette, I'm really sorry, but can you just, because I know I've missed a bunch of meetings, but can you just briefly explain what the notification is and what the cache is?
Sure. So we had three basic scenarios. Really, we had notifications. I just want to know that something changed, and I want to sort of watch the feed and see if something changed that is something I care about, and I just want to know that it changed, or that something was added or removed. And so in that case, they don't necessarily even keep a cache, but they might need to take an action based on these notifications. Then the full cache is the other end, where this is what the questioning authority architecture does, where Dave has a cache set up and he has all the data for a particular authority. And so the idea is that long term, we want to be able to keep that authority, the cache, in sync with the original authority. And so everything that changes, because it is a full cache, we want all the changes, and we want to be able to update the cache with all those changes. And sort of sitting in between those is a partial cache. And this commonly plays out as, I have an application, I have grabbed a URI for a field, and I want to be able to show my users the label, not the URI, because they don't know how to interpret the URI. And so I cache the label associated with that URI. So in my user interface, I can show them the label. And that's a pretty typical partial cache. Sometimes they might cache a little bit more, but that's the most common thing for a partial cache. And so I'm wondering if the RDF patch documents how we would want to recommend that.
Well, for notifications, isn't it just this URI has a change? You need to go look at it.
Yeah, that's what I think would happen.
I mean, I guess you could basically treat that as dig into the patch and pull the URI rather than setting up a separate service.
Yeah, so I am definitely, when I look at it, I do try to fill all three of these with the same feed. Like, I wouldn't want to have to do multiple feeds. If I were maintaining it, I wouldn't want to have to do that.
Right, I was wondering about that, Lynette, and whether or not it's on the consumer to just drop the stuff that they don't want. Like you're saying for the partial cache, like if they're only using the label and the URI, but some other stuff changed as well, whether or not they would just ignore that.
Well, there's partial in terms of representation, and there's partial in terms of population. One basically is a projection of the triples. The other one is a filtering of relevant subject URIs.
So whether or not the entity is relevant versus whether or not data.
Right. I think Vitus was mentioning that, where he just wants to keep his locally represented subject URIs up to date, as opposed to having them all present.
That is correct.
But that implies that there's some filtering mechanism present on one end of that pipeline or the other, that basically does that reduction.
Right, and I don't think the data like LC doesn't want to go to Stanford's catalog to see if they have a heading in their bib records before providing.
I wasn't presuming a particular use case. I was looking at the architectural alternatives.
I'm showing sympathy for the provider.
Yeah, I think it would be up to Stanford to filter the activity stream and look for the things that are relevant to us.
It is interesting that you talk about filtering, because in the process of trying to find what activities the various streams were providing, I would have loved to have had the ability to just say, I only want to see the add or create activities, and anything else in there is just don't show it to me.
Yeah,
So
or the
it does seem
label,
like-
the
Oh.
label change being one particular example that I think a lot of libraries, if they are partially caching just the URI and the label, then that's what they would be interested in.
Yeah, and I don't think that would be that difficult for a provider to do. Like, for them to do a filter where you only see particular entities, that might be more challenging, but I would think filtering by activity type might not be that bad. So that might be a nice recommendation. So it seems like, based on what folks are saying, having the RDF patch for each activity, if it's a partial cache, is a good idea. And if someone's just getting notifications, they just ignore the instrument that has the RDF patch in it. And that's consistent with some of the conversations we've had before. So I wonder, Dave, since you are sort of representative as someone who's working with a full cache, how do you feel about navigating through all the activities in order to update your cache versus having a bulk file that gives you all the patches for like a page in the activity stream?
That's totally dependent upon scale. So if we're talking about one of the small authority sources in LC, a bulk reload is trivial. It takes seconds. But if I'm looking at, 15 billion triples to reload a big authority, incrementally amortizing that cost by the activity stream, since very little of it changes, say major release to major release, it's far less expensive to process the stream than it is to do a bulk reload. And that's a spectrum, and there's, examples all across that spectrum of scale. I see that right now in NLM's Medline feeds. Annually, they release a baseline release of everything. But after that, you have to process the updates to be, quote, up to date with respect to Medline content.
So Dave, that's because mesh changes?
Well, there's also just some years the baseline release is structured exactly like the previous year's XML, but there are changes to the XML over time as well in terms of structure of the records. And so that change occurs at a baseline release, and from there out, you're seeing new structure. So you think about that as the graph changed. and to have a proper representation where you suddenly reify the property, for instance, you'd have to have a full dump to properly contain the new reified property. Does everybody know what reification means?
Why don't you go ahead and define it?
So trivial cases of properties are just subject, predicate, object, where the object's like a literal. But if you've got a bunch of stuff you need to hang off of the property itself, you need to turn the, quote unquote, you need to turn the property into an object so you can have the property contain objects that creates the relationship. So the middle thing turns into an object in your own right, and then get to the original object, you've got to go from subject, predicate object, and predicate object to original object. So it's more complex, but that allows you to have properties hanging off the predicate itself. Like, when did this property get asserted?
Yeah, that's nice to have in some cases.
Yeah.
I feel like that's really good for being able to do, I've lost the term.
Provenance?
Provenance. Yes.
Yeah.
It came to me at the same time. Provenance. So you know.
Who asserted this property? When did it get asserted?
Yes.
Why did it get asserted?
Yes. So I guess the question I have then, Dave, it sounds like that you would be open to processing the activity stream and getting the RDF patch from each activity in the feed.
Yeah. I mean, if for the big guys, if I could avoid having to do bulk reloads and just, nonstop keep things up to date, that means that I'm in as near real-time sync as the activity stream is real-time.
Okay, good. So I think that's good, because then we have one set of recommendations regardless of which of those use cases we're talking about. And I think that all three use cases would be able to be fulfilled if they followed the specification that we put out that would meet for full cache. So I guess that's all I had on the agenda for today. We have like 15 minutes left, so I will kind of toss it out there and see if someone has a subject that we haven't talked about. I'm working towards sort of firming up the documentation. I'm probably going to rewrite it, at least give an attempt at rewriting it in the format that was used for IIIF, because I just found it a little easier to follow than writing it out as the vocabulary. I feel like you had to have some prior knowledge in the vocabulary format to understand how everything fits together. And so I think they did more of a narrative of, this is like the first thing you want to create, and then you want to put pages underneath it, and then you want to put activities in it. And I think that just leads people to that information in an easier way to understand. So I'm going to take a crack at that, hopefully this week, so that it would be available for our next meeting, and see if we can't tighten some of this up, and definitely get some other eyes on the wording, to do some editing on that end, make sure that it's worded in a way that's understandable, and then see if we can't tidy things up. So my question, I guess, since we have a little bit of time left, is, are there any subjects that folks have that we haven't talked about that we need to talk about before we start closing stuff up? And
I'd like to go back to the issue of create versus add, and
Sure.
the definition of those, to get a bit of clarification. Maybe it's just because I'm not familiar with the activity stream terminology, but the definition for add refers to a target, right? And I'm wondering what is the target? Is it like the authority file is the target, or or is it like a record within an authority file? If you add something to a particular authority record, could that be an add? Or is it only adding an authority record to the file?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think we should definitely put some clarification in there. My take on it is that add is of the authority record itself. And that if you define a target, it would be the authority. So you're adding a new person to the target LCNAF. That's how I read that.
But if you add an object to an existing authority, that would be an update, right?
Yes. Well, say that again. I want to make sure I say that correctly. If you change the data, so like you have one piece of data in an authority record and you add one more scope node or something like that, that would be an update. And to that authority record that would be identified by the ID of the update.
Yeah, I guess I'm just confused about the definition of what is an object. I mean, if you add something to an authority record, let's say you add a link to another object or to another authority record, would that would be just changing the content of that authority record, and it would be an update. So it's not like adding an object, in terms of the the definition of add, it doesn't apply to some activity like that, right?
Yes, so I'm not sure I fully followed your question, so I'm gonna answer what I think I heard, and then you can ask again if I didn't quite get that right. So to me, the target is the authority, the object is the authority record, and the RDF patch would have the individual changes that happen to the object. And so that would be like on an update level. Or if it's new, if it's a create, then it would be the entire authority record.
Yeah, I think I got it now. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, and I think it might be good to put that kind of information into the document itself, just to have like a terminology section that says you're going to see these terms, you're going to see target, you're going to see object, and this is how we interpret it in the context of entity metadata management. So anything else? All right, so Vitus, I would ask you to look over the document you had created previously, and maybe next time, if there's still some questions related to that, we can go over that document and see how it fits with the conversations we've had to date. And if no one has anything else, I think we can call today's meeting adjourned. Did you have a comment, Vitus, that you wanted to make?
No, I was just going to say that, yes, I'll do that.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Peter.
Thank you.